And I'm hosting this series of webinars on behalf of the Tree Action Plan delivery team in Natural England, which we've put together with colleagues from Forestry Commission, Forest Research and the Environment Agency. My team gives advice on woody habitat creation schemes to ensure that trees are planted in the best possible location without compromising other nature recovery. If we go to the next slide, please. We've got a few housekeeping rules. All the webinars will be recorded and will be made available in due course, alongside a PDF of the slides and a collection of recommended follow-up resources. We recommend that you listen to them in order if possible. Please put questions in the chat or hold on to them until the question section at the end, which will probably be slightly shorter than 30 minutes this time. Next slide, please. This series of slides is designed to help us understand the importance of wet woody habitats. And last week we heard from Dan Abrahams, who explained the rich diversity within wet woodlands and went through different types of wet woodlands with the different expressions dependent on soils, peaty or mineral and the sources of water. It was illustrated with case studies from Gareth Fisher from RSPB, who illustrated how fairly simple interventions in existing woodlands to re-wet them shows rapid recovery in terms of species using them. Today, Ian Dyack, Natural England's wetland specialist, along with Alice Milner from the Royal Holloway University, will explore how wet woody habitats function. We can't cover everything in these webinars, but we hope this is a strong framework covering key issues that you should consider, with pointers about where you can find out more information. Next slide, please. The Tree Action Plan delivery team worked towards 6 ecological principles for woodland creation, and one of those is around increasing the potential for wet woodlands. And this webinar series was initially designed as a learning tool for the team. However, this subject is highly relevant across other parts of Natural England and across the other organisations. So it's great to have this webinar series to share across the organisations, and welcome to everybody. And I'll now pass over to Ian to kick us off. Thanks, Ian.
Right, yeah, I'm going to be talking about ecohydrology of wet woodlands today. I'm Ian Dyack. I'm in Natural England's Chief Scientist Directorate. I'm Principal Specialist for Wetlands, and obviously wet woodlands are wetlands, so it's kind of on the verge of what I deal with. But over the years, I've built up quite a lot of experience working in these amazing habitats and looking at how we integrate them with open wetlands, which is generally the focus of my job. Right, so what are we going to cover? One, back to basics, kind of looking at some really simple concepts about water and how it moves in landscapes and what that means for what grows. And then talking specifically about water-dependent woods and wooded mires, ecohydrology in those and around them, and the environmental requirements for different sorts of woodlands, wetlands. And 3, we'll touch on the various resources that are out there that can help you to understand them. So, back to basics. John Major, if you remember him. But the most basic thing to think about is that why are wet woody habitats where they are? And I suppose the corollary of that is, if you're going to create them, think about, okay, where's it going to be in this landscape? Where does their water come from? How does it get there? What are the key factors that determine what we end up with in growing in these places and living in those places, and whether that's good? I can hear somebody talking in the background. You'd mute, please. And then how can we find out about all of those things? So here's a quick task, a bit of audience participation. Ali, are you all lined up? If you have a quick brainstorm, and Ali's going to produce a lovely word cloud at the end of this. The first question: what range of wet habitats and features do you think we get within wet woodlands? So just whatever you think of, just write it down. Or Ali, are you going to put a request out? Spend a couple of minutes typing stuff in. I'll carry on talking. And also,
you can put an extra one in if you've done one already and you want to do another. You can just change it and submit it again.
Are people only allowed one?
Oh, they can do multiple.
Yeah, great. And when you've done that, just think about what the key factors are that determine the different types of habitat within the category of wet woody habitats, wet woodlands. That'd be great. So if you do that, and Emma, are you going to report back on that?
Yeah, so if you want to answer the second question in the chat, I will read them out. So we've got the first contender is tufa.
Oh, exciting.
What are the key factors? That answers in the chat for that one, please. Soils, that's a key factor.
That's a good one.
Hydrology of the water table, humidity, water availability, geology, groundwater, geographical location, canopy species, topography, drainage, the seed banks, aspect. They're all coming at once now. Nitrate, fertilizer runoff, ephemeral or permanently wet, management or non-intervention, saprophilic wildlife, hydrological flow direction, grazing or browsing, ground vegetation, management, amount of light, topography, water table.
I saw good stuff. This doesn't sound like we need to talk. Everybody knows it. we are going to talk more about many of these different aspects, but that's great, isn't it? That I think people are thinking a lot more about wet woodlands than maybe they were a couple of years ago.
Surrounding land use. I'm going to shut up now.
Right, I'll move on. Brilliant. Thank you. So, talking about wetland ecohydrology and some concepts and principles, and I've just got a little asterisk there. To my mind, wet woodlands are wetlands. They're just wet places with trees and woody plants growing in them. Just as we think of open wetlands, they just haven't got trees growing in them. So the concepts are exactly the same. All of those things we worry about in open wetlands are exactly the same as the things that we should worry about in wet woodlands. And it's always been a bit of a surprise to me how little we consider external pressures and all the things that we worry about in open wetlands in wet woodlands. So if we can move that on today, that would be great. But just to say, ecohydrology is a kind of integrative science and looks at how water and it works within the ecosystem and all the parts of that ecosystem, and tries to pull it all together into a sort of coherent picture rather than just thinking about, oh, what's the water doing, what's growing. It's bringing all that together because there are so many interactions and feedbacks. You've got to think like that to understand wetlands of all sorts, including wet woodlands. So obviously wetlands exist for a reason. They're wet. Some of the questions to think through, why is there a wet woodland here rather than, say, an open wetland? What type of wet woodland is it? Where's the water coming from? Where's it going to? And how does it move within the site? What affects the chemistry and nutrient status of the water coming into the site and as it moves through the site? And I suppose thinking about, is that different when it when it goes through, and the kind of ameliorating function of wet woodlands. How does this affect the resident biology, animals, plants, and fungi? And another thing that we need to think about in these systems, as Dan talked about last week and Gareth covered, understanding modifications that have been made to natural hydrology and hydrochemistry, and what effect they have and have had on the wet woodland and the kind of general health of the ecosystem. So these are all things that we will cover in less or more detail coming up. And also just to sort of underline some sort of core principles that I'll be kind of talking, everything I talk about will be within this frame, and that is that the natural, i.e. unmodified hydrological regime system forms the template for any kind of assessment of wet woodland integrity or quality. This is very much in line with our climate change adaptation principles. Could have given you a link to that actually, Emma. The Lawton report and the Water Framework Directive as well, all of which are based around sort of re-establishment of natural function processes within landscapes and ecosystems. I think by sort of following on, natural state should also provide the template for restoration and creation. And we've outlined a lot of these principles and kind of expounded on them in a couple of research reports that we've done internally. First one of those was the Freshwater and Wetland Habitat Narrative, which covers all wetland habitats, and then the Integrated Biodiversity Report, which broadened out those principles from the Freshwater and Wetland Habitat Narrative to all habitats, dry, wet, whatever. So worth a read, and they'll be passed around. And the final one that some of the concepts are quite simple, but the details may be a bit trickier. So you do need to go out and survey and look at these various things and understand what the reference date might have been before you think about restoration and creation. So just going back to kind of what a wetland is and why it's a wetland. I've stolen some of this from Brian Wheeler, who's an eminent wetland ecologist, used to be at Sheffield University, and his twin pillars of wetlands concept, which kind of described wetlands as being fundamentally a product of water supply and topography. So they're the two pillars all wetlands sort of depend on, and obviously the interaction between them. So thinking about the water supply can come from rain. Obviously all wetlands receive rainfall from springs. So this is water coming out of the ground from aquifers, groundwater aquifers. Come from surface runoff, where you've got more impermeable soils, and all of these provide water. Topography, the shape of the landscape in which the wetland occurs. So it could be basin, could be on a slope, could be a flat floodplain, and obviously that shape determines how long the water resides in a particular place. And wetlands can develop in one or both two main circumstances: where there is strong impedance to the drainage of water, i.e. in a basin, or in a flat place that's got very little fall and may have obstacles within that, all of which will impede the flow of water. And the second point is where there's a high and fairly constant rate of supply, somewhere where it's sort of climatically wet, it rains a lot, or it's immediately below a spring, permanent spring. And Brian used this picture. I think this it's a station in the Chilterns, but it's got a water tank, as you'll see up there. And just look at that, it's got a bit of wet woodland growing in it, and it just demonstrates you've got rainfall and you've got a tank, holds water, seed gets in, you've got a wetland. Dead simple. There we go. So That's why you get wetlands. And we've got another little interactive bit now. We've got this kind of highly, this little simplified diagram of a cross section through a landscape and a river valley. And there's a whole series of water exchange mechanisms, you could call them, just water moving from one place to another.
I'm gonna walk up the moor.
And each of those has, ignore the A, B, C, D, and E, all those little initial letters there. If you could, we can't do it. People talking, I mean, just write in the chat what you think they all are, going from left to right. If the different colours on the diagram, the brown represents something like clay, something quite impermeable. The bricky green brick, that is some kind of aquifer, so water can move relatively freely within that. The blue is a river. I don't know what the yellow could just be a peat or alluvium. Yellow and green, peat and alluvium. So if you could just write in to the chat and see if you get them all.
Right, they're way ahead of you. They started about 3 minutes ago. So we've got seepage, E, evaporation, precipitation, evaporation, runoff, seepage, surface run, ground source, groundwater flow, groundwater recharge, pumping, overpumping, overland flow, sorry.
Yeah.
I can't read all of that. Counterintuitive, but raised bogs are poor nutrient wetlands. Not aware of any in Devon, Cornwall, but I used to live near Lochar Moss, Dumfries, which I believe is the largest lowland raised bog in Europe, now undergoing some restoration.
There are raised bogs in Devon.
Water movement pathways, spring. D, evaporation and precipitation, groundwater discharge, groundwater recharge, pumping, ground source, springs, evaporation, precipitation, rainfall, evapotranspiration, overland flow. They're running out now. That's a lot.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I think we got them. They were all there covered, weren't they? I'll go from right to left. Yeah, R is of course runoff, so that's coming off relatively impermeable soils. The water doesn't infiltrate, so it runs off the surface, picks up whatever's in its way. GS that's coming from the groundwater aquifers, groundwater seepage. P, precipitation, evaporation. GR, you have got infiltration up through the soil down into the aquifer there, and sort of groundwater recharge and groundwater discharge, where you have high water tables within the aquifer. Overbank flow. OFAB, not sure about that. PE, pumping, obviously S would be a spring, which is a more discrete, well, it could be a spring or a seepage. A spring is a kind of discrete outflow, and a seepage is just a more diffuse groundwater outflow from either wherever the water table is, meets the surface, or where you have different strata of different permeabilities. And where the water hits the lower permeability stratum, it will emerge at the surface. So yeah, that was good. So I hope that helps just sort of help you think about the different ways that the water can be moving into your wetland or out of your wetland. This little section is about how we describe these features and how complex and confusing it is. And yeah, I think even for people who work in it, it's complex and confusing. So for people who don't deal with it a lot, I think the language we use is not particularly helpful, because wetlands and wet woodlands can be described in terms of a landscape context. They can be described in terms of a water supply mechanism, water chemistry. So it's an acidic woodland or something. Nutrient status, Management regime, so people call things a fen meadow, which is essentially it's a fen, but it's just grazed or cut, or coppice. Well, you know, it's the same stuff growing in it. They just cut it every so often. Do lots of different types of ways of describing vegetation and various other classifications, all of which is confusing and leads to kind of misunderstanding, misclassifications, and you know, sometimes that does result in sites being damaged because they're not described properly, or they haven't, you know, haven't thought about the different aspects of them. So through a process with the Environment Agency and Natural England and Countryside Council for Wales in the 2000s, a big project to try to describe wetland features. I would say not wet woodlands weren't really included in this, and to describe them from sort of detailed analysis and a bottom-up description of these different components that would allow us. I mean, the primary motivation was to understand the impacts of things like abstraction, nutrient enrichment on European protected sites, so SACs particularly. So the wetland framework was born, which was based on analysis of, you know, very detailed study of a lot of wetland sites, some of which did include wet woodlands as well. And it sort of pulls out all of the drivers of what is manifested in the sort of the biological feature that we value, and it's sort of pared down to these particular things. So if you look in the bottom corner here, you've got the major drivers, big scale drivers: landscape, topography, you know, the shape of the different features within that landscape, and then the hydrogeology, thinking of particularly groundwater and how that works. All of those drive the water supply, which then to some extent drives vegetation types, but also those hydrogeology, landscape topography drive environmental conditions, which give you the chemistry and the nutrients. And so all of these are interacting, but ultimately they're all giving you a particular vegetation type in a particular place based on all of those factors. And I mean, this is very useful as well, I think, for, you know, what we're talking about today in LNRSs and things like that, and, you know, very place-based nature, which is, you know, the how you generate the most biodiversity, because every place is unique, every place generates different conditions which support different animals and plants, and that's how you achieve, you know, your most representative and highest biodiversity, most resilience to change of various sorts, all of these things. So, you know, it makes a lot of sense, this approach. And of course, the use it was going to be put to, particularly, was looking at abstraction impacts and discharges and various things that were going to change those environmental conditions which drive, obviously, what grows and what lives in them. So what was developed is the wetland framework. And although I say this has been used very much for open wetlands, it's totally applicable to wet woodlands as well. And I think it's a really useful way of approaching wet woodlands, what state they're in now, what they could be, and where's the best place for particular types of wet woodlands. So the first part of it is wetland landscape type, and they came up with these different landscapes, all of which feature wetlands in some way. Base richness is highly important in generating what you get and influencing what can grow there, but obviously dependent on geology. Fertility, very important again in determining what you end up with. And of course, there's the natural background fertility, which is driven by catchment processes. and geology, and there's obviously cultural factors in that as well, which need a secondary consideration. The really new part of this was this development of water supply mechanisms, which is shortened to WetMech, and there are 20 of those. I'm not going to talk about that detail, but that essentially they are different variants of rain-fed systems, groundwater-fed systems, surface water-fed systems, and different features within those. And obviously management has a major impact, particularly in open wetlands, on what the biological manifestation of all of these abiotic factors is. So, as I said, the WetMechs, the water supply mechanisms, is just a way of saying it's the nature of the water supply to a site. And as I've said earlier, there are four key types to think about, really. The first one is rainfall, or precipitation, which is a better term, really, because that includes things like snow, which is generally acidic and low in nutrient. Something that is also worth considering, is often not really considered, is the importance of mist and fog and other occult precipitation, which certainly for bogs, particularly blanket bogs in the uplands, is incredibly important in kind of just providing an ongoing supply of moisture, dampness to sites. But it's also very important in the sort of the west coast temperate rainforest situation, where the kind of bryophyte lichen epiphytic flora is highly dependent on that kind of constant humidity provided by occult precipitation for its survival. Surface water fed, as we said, that's runoff essentially. Quality and chemistry depends on the natural background conditions plus whatever happens upstream in the catchment. River fed, fluvial fed, obviously largely in floodplains, and compared to the others, it can be more variable over time, periods of a glut and drought. The river's low. And again, the chemistry and the nutrients depend very much on what happens upstream in the catchment and catchment land use. So, yeah, hugely variable from, say, upland catchments, very low intensity land use compared with lowland catchments, which tend to have far more intensive agriculture generally, but also sewage and septic tanks and things like that. And finally, groundwater fed, where the pH will depend on largely on the geology. The amount of water will depend on the size of the aquifer and the condition of the aquifer, and how. And again, we're thinking about cultural pressures, abstraction, and things like that, which may be reducing the size of the aquifer through dewatering. And again, it can be enriched by whatever happens in the above it, land use, particularly nitrates. And I'm sure most of you will be aware that currently most aquifers certainly in lowland England, are highly nitrate enriched compared with background, and that's the size of the aquifer as well, and the height of the water table of the aquifer is obviously very important in where that intersects with the surface and when it discharges and when it doesn't. And that can be, depending on the size of the aquifer and its responsiveness, that you can get permanent flows. And I think it's been very noticeable this summer that because we've had wet weather over the last 2 years, where you've got strong aquifers, still very, very wet sites, even though it's been so dry, and where you've got smaller aquifers that are kind of more responsive to rainfall, they've been much drier. So groundwater can be incredibly important in sustaining wetlands through dry periods. So if you run a couple, I thought we could, Dan talked to us about NVC wet woodlands last week. So I thought if we ran through a couple of those and just see how they sit within the wetland framework and where those, where they come out across each of the different attributes. So the first one we're going to do is W5, older greater tussock sedge woodland. This picture is not quite right for this. You can write in the chat why you think it might be a bit wrong, but it's interesting in that we create these NVC communities which aren't brilliant and aren't based on a huge number of samples, and actually the conditions within them can support quite they're not always exactly what it says in the book, and I think, well, this picture is an example. But anyway, W5 older greater tussock sedge woodland. In terms of landscape types, I mean, it occurs in very wet places generally, so it's going to be in valley head troughs and basins, everywhere. Troughs outside of valleys and in floodplains, particularly in depressions within floodplains. Water supply mechanism, there are quite a few of them, just ignore that. As long as you've got a trough, you can get this type of woodland. But the base richness is very important. If in kind of establishing this, it tends to be in base rich and subneutral, not in acidic conditions. In terms of fertility, it's in the lowlands, in the kind of lower end of fertility gradient, call that mesotrophic. And I mean, what this system does, it helps you to think about, okay, so that's in mesotrophic conditions. What happens if you've got all of these other conditions? So the landscape type is the same, base richness type is the same, but you've got eutrophic or hypertrophic conditions. Do you still get W5? And the answer is probably no. The more nutrient rich it gets, particularly cultural sources, it's going to go towards W6, which is the older nettle community. And we've got lots of examples of that throughout the lowlands, where we've got historic records that show this type of woodland, quite species rich, species of relatively low nutrients have been lost, particularly in the latter half of the 20th century, and there's lots of W6 woodland there with nettle and elder and more bramble and loss of a lot of these other things. So it's useful for that in terms of thinking, okay, of eutrophic conditions, would we be able to establish W5? Probably not. But you think, okay, well, what do we need to do upstream to reduce the nutrient supplies? And then the management thing, I mean, generally, these woodlands aren't managed. They might have been coppiced a bit in the past, but most of them now are unmanaged. So, and to contrast that with W7 and how that comes out. So W7 is this older ash, yellow pimpernel wood, which tend to get on slopes. So you look at your wetland habitat landscape type, hill slope, valley head. It does occur in floodplains as well, but often underneath situations where you've got these groundwater outflows from hill slopes. And so wet mech, okay, you go water supply 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, they're all groundwater fed supplies. Base richness, it can occur in kind of subneutral, but it tends to be more base rich, with quite a lot of calcareous calcicolous species very often. So comparing it to the W5, you're saying, okay, well, it tends to be more, although it roughly the same pH, it's often more base rich, but the water supply mechanism is quite different. This tends to be much more uniformly groundwater fed, and not in basins, but in slopey sites, valley sites. It also tends to be more lower nutrient, which is largely driven by the water supply coming out of aquifers. So as long as you've not got an enriched aquifer, the water is generally going to be lower nutrient. They're oligotrophic, tending towards mesotrophic. As we talked about in the other one, if the nutrient levels increased towards eutrophic, hypertrophic, you will lose a lot of the interest associated with this towards a more sort of nettle dominated sort of thing that we see in many of our wet woodlands throughout the country, unfortunately. And again, management, well, there might be a bit of management, but generally they're fairly unmanaged. So that's a bit of theory, and I've now just got various examples of these and sort of with aspects to talk through around kind of the influences and things. And I thought I could use Dan's, it's not Dan's, the one Dan nicked from the National Trust, I've nicked from Dan, and replaced his text. So this Dan had this shown W7. So again, just conceptualizing this and looking at a landscape and thinking, hey, what kind of woodland is it? Looking at the landscape and thinking, okay, what are the conditions going to be here? So this is where Dan had W7. So you've got a slope. You could have groundwater emerging from the kind of, you probably have the aquifer would sit below the surface here. They'd probably get a water going through the cracks in the rock, weathered cracks in the rock, and emerging lower down the slopes where that weathering kind of stops, which is often, I don't know, 20, 30 meters down into the bedrock. So slopes emerging, sorry, groundwater emerging on the slopes, and then flushing over the surface, creating wet conditions. Down in the floodplain, obviously you've got all the runoff coming off the slope, as well as any accumulated groundwater that's been generated on the slope. And I think it's not always safe to assume that groundwater always finds its way down, because it may infiltrate again in a more permeable bit below the seepage, but often it'll run all the way down. And because this is an area that floods, it can be highly dynamic. So the topography may change. You get different blockages and things deposited, gravel being deposited, highly dynamic. And because you've got a great supply of nutrients, sediment from the river, it's probably going to be more nutrient rich than the slopes. And obviously, if you've got intensive land use higher up, it's going to be much more nutrient rich. This looks like a pretty clean catchment, so you'd expect sort of the water quality to reflect natural background values here. This one down here, this again is sort of depressions within the floodplain, which can move as the river floods. It depends on the amount of deposition and also how saturated it remains, and whether nutrients sort of pile up within depressions as well. And finally, this is the one where Dan, I think, with bog woodland. So right, there could be a little basin in the river terrace here with a groundwater feed, which will be permanently saturated. So you get peat developing in that. And the something that I'm not sure Alice might talk about, but the interesting, looking at old references about succession in wetlands and the kind of where wet woodland sits within that. Back in the 50s, there was a kind of idea that wet woodland would go through effect. You get an open wetland, trees would colonise, wet woodland, and then the wet woodland becomes dry woodland, and that oak woodland is the climax community, which we've learned, and I'm sure people at the time knew that that's not right in a lot of situations, like this one, for instance. You may have trees at some point in that peak development, but ultimately, unless you drain that site, it's going to stay very wet, and the trajectory, as you can see through peat taking cores into peat bogs, the ultimate trajectory for that would be a raised bog. So it would go through a phase of having wet woodland on it, but ultimately it would become a raised bog, maybe with one or two trees around the edges struggling to survive, but dry woodland would not be the trajectory. So the next slides towards the end, I've got some examples of situations in real wet woodlands and some pictures, and just issues about drainage and pressures and restoration as well. So we're going to start off with some floodplain woodland. These cross sections they just show that within the floodplain, particularly the bottom one, just ignore the top one, you get different conditions across the floodplain. You get which vary in space and in time. So in the winter, you may get significant flooding, or maybe flooding for months, which obviously changes growing conditions considerably. And within that floodplain, you'll get depressions and raised areas where you're going to get different conditions. So different trees, different plants are going to grow there, and you've got surface runoff. So quite a varied landscape. And this is the sort of place where you'll get alluvial floodplain woodland developing, which is obviously a habitats directive woodland type, as Dan said last time. Now almost there's hardly any of it left, and it would at one time have been all over floodplains in this country. This picture is from a lovely bit of alluvial floodplain woodland in the New Forest. You can see in there you've got alder falling over, marsh marigold, a bit of marsh valerian. You'll see bog pondweed growing in depressions within that floodplain. So this is about as natural as you can get in England. Absolutely gorgeous habitat. It will be great. There will be animals go in there irregularly, the cattle and the ponies, but generally not grazed. This rises in the New Forest, flows through the New Forest, so it's a very clean catchment. No intensive agricultural activity, no application of fertilizers, no sewage works, no septic tanks, and that's what you get. The contrast in the floodplain situation where you have high nutrients is obviously you get a lot more nettles, much higher phosphorus and nitrate availability, and it tends to be a lot less diverse. Alder is still present. Alder's very tolerant and will grow in all of these situations, but the things that grow with it are very different. Dense, tall nettles, comfrey, and this is actually at the bottom of my garden. I took it yesterday to try and identify. And there is a bit of small teasel, so there is not without interest, and obviously there's huge structural interest, but they're very modified from what they would be in a natural state. The second type we're going to look at, this is going to be a groundwater fed site. We've got permanent seepage from a groundwater source. This little cross-sectional diagram shows a sort of fissured limestone aquifer. So typical of harder limestones, it's not chalk. Chalk's got more sort of interpore storage. So the water moves through fissures within the limestone rather than being held between particles. So something like this, you would have a strong flow throughout the year. generally. That diagram just shows the red bit shows where you get the typical vegetation developing on the limestone. And so this is an example. This is from Shropshire. This is Whitwell Coppice, which is triple SI. It's an incredible woodland. This is a very broad flow of spring water coming down the slope. It's got tufa formation right across it. So there's tufa forming on little stones, tufa forming across fallen logs, and one of the kind of interesting things about this is the presence of this moss, Palustriella commutata, which is very typical of tufa forming systems and strongly associated with tufa. And this moss just encrusts with calcium carbonate as well and builds up these tufa dams and mounds within the system, which obviously then generate further complexity in the system. So this is very strongly alkaline water. It would be sort of 7.5 pH, something like that. Very rich wood ground flora here, including herb Paris, and you can see there's a bit of giant horsetail there, but it's very heavily grazed by deer. I'm sure Emma can pick out signs out. I mean, they're even eating all the pendulous sedge. Somebody mentioned tufa earlier on, didn't they? Tufa is one of the rarest wetland habitats in this country. Some really good ones in wet woodlands. So look out for them and do record them. This is another spring-fed site. This is on Stiper Stones under a series of springs and seepages, W7 woodland, ash, bird cherry, alder, very rich ground flora. And you can see there's a bit of sphagnum there where it's raised up out of the influence of the ground water. So quite complex. If you notice here, you've got all this open water flowing down the slope. This is just down the hill from it. This is an explantation. It's ditched. It's exactly the same situation, but it's ditched. So you've got dry fern-dominated vegetation, bit of sphagnum in the bottom of the drains. We've done a bit of blocking here, and it's incredibly effective, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. But this sort of demonstrates, the change that you get from a bit of drainage. This is what happens if you get nutrients into the system, lots of nettles and brambles, and this is drained. Exactly the same system, but much more highly nutrient enriched. This last example, looking at valley wetlands in troughs, this little diagram just shows the water supplies there. You've got springs coming in at the side, and you've got flow across from that water, and then you've got flow down the system as well as the water accumulates over a peat base, and then you've got upwelling from the bottom underneath as well. When you drain that, as happens in many valleys with woods or not, drain down the middle, drains across, and then catch drains to catch all the groundwater. So many valleys across the country have got this, which obviously has a huge dewatering effect, drains out the surface and then you'll get the biological change. Abstraction, I'm not going to talk about much, but there are examples where abstraction's having a massive impact on wet woodland sites, particularly in East Anglia, where we've seen change from older tussock sedge woodland to older nettle woodland, just because the water table has dropped so far, the peat starts oxidizing, releases nutrients, and nettles can grow, and you lose all the wetland stuff. This is Yarner Wood, Dartmoor, triple SI. It's a drained valley woodland with bits of mire in it. And recently it's had a natural flood management scheme on. So if you look at this picture, you've got slopes coming down, and you've got the base of the woodland mire, but over the last few hundred years, it's been highly modified. This is a ditch put in at the bottom of the slope to catch the water coming off the slopes. There's one on the other side, and there's a whole series of cross drains in the bottom as well. This whole area was quite heavily industrial sort of hundreds of years ago, and there were all sorts of activity going on here. So they'll have drained the woodland for various reasons. But we are left with that legacy now. We notify the site while it's like that, and up until recently had done very little about restoring it. So what's happening here is there's a natural flood management scheme, and they're essentially felling timber and using it as kind of, you could call it kind of leaky dams, I suppose, in the watercourse, which is having some effect. But there are still lots of other ditches within this system. So rather than approach this from a natural hydrology restoration, it was seen as a natural flood management thing with these techniques in. Ideally, you would fill all these drains in completely to restore the natural hydrology and to get the maximum benefits. And I think longer term, we will do that now. Within this woodland, there are still really nice bits. There's kind of a lot of water flushing over the surface where the drains are less effective. And there is some miry bits with purple moorgrass and quite a lot of sphagnum in as well. But we'd expect this to expand massively and the sphagnum to start growing much more once it's blocked properly. Woods in basins, these are quakey systems where you've got terrestrialization of a lake with water, a floating raft growing over the top, which are quite common in places like the Midlands, Meres and Mosses. This is an absolutely gorgeous bit of wet woodland, quite dangerous, where you've got a raft of about 1 metre floating over several metres of water, but incredibly rich. Osmere, Shropshire, there's a bit of royal fern, the bottom left, which is characteristic of these systems. Another one, there's quite a lot of marsh fern in here. Again, very quakey, very dangerous, but it's like a bit of primeval habitat, and it's very uncommon to see. Finally, this is the contrast here is an acidic system, very peat-stained water, and you can see within these systems the trees go over because it's a very unstable environment. So that generates a lot of dynamism and creates niches for all sorts of uncommon species, like this least burr reed, which is growing in a root plate pool here. So what have we got from all of that? So the key factors to go over, you've got to think about, where is the water coming from? Is it surface water? Is it groundwater? Is it precipitation? All of those combination, which are, the more significant. How does that affect water chemistry? What are the substrates? How does that affect things? Do they vary across the sites? What's the site management and history? Has the site been drained? The drain's effective? What would you need to do to restore natural hydrology? Are there nutrient pressures? What would you expect this if it was in a natural condition? Are they in the groundwater and the surface water? And finally, different water supply mechanisms can give you the same type of woodland, and the same type of woodland can have more than one supply mechanism to it. So we need to understand that. And the last slide, and possibly one of the most important for those out on the ground, how do we know? How can we study this? How can we understand it? Obviously, maps are incredibly important, geology and soil maps and old surveys. And testing in the field's great. There's no better way of getting to know sites and understanding these than actually going prodding in them and measuring stuff. So little handheld pH meter, do electrical conductivity with that. Take an auger out, what's in the soil? So peat, what's the organic content? Is it sandy in places? Do soil sampling, water sampling, hydrological monitoring, and also old biological records can be really useful. It's giving you the kind of reference state. Right, by that grew there. Okay, that tells me this, tells me that. Old maps, presence of peat obviously tells you it has been or is extremely wet, saturated all the time. Okay, right. I've gone on longer than I thought, and moving on to Alice, who will be able to talk in more detail about some of these things.
Thanks, Ian. I'm just going to upload my talk. So talk amongst yourselves. Thanks. I should probably start with saying who I am. So I'm a senior lecturer, associate professor at Royal Holloway, University of London, and most of my research is on peatlands, but I've got a lot more into wet woodlands recently because I was trying to get a bit more focus on them. So I lead the Wet Woodland Research Network, which is a network of scientists and organisations, individuals, anyone interested in wet woodlands, and that's why I'm here today and trying to pull together some of the research that's happening on these ecosystems. And now that Ian's looked at all the water side of things, I really want to focus a bit more on the tree interactions with the waters and how that they create these functioning wet woody habitats. And the hydrology is always the main controller. It kind of sets the stage, so to speak, but then the trees and the interactions brings it all to life. I'm going to have to focus on some overarching similarities of tree-water interactions because we've seen from Dan's talk last week and Ian just now that they're so varied. So we're going to try and think about some of the similarities of those tree-water interactions. And just as a caveat, there's probably quite a few people here on this webinar that know a lot more about some of this than I do. So please just add extra bits into the chat. And if anyone wants more details of certain things, I can follow up afterwards. I didn't want to assume knowledge of people on the call. So in my mind, a wet woodland is not just a wet place with trees, it's this functioning wetland ecosystem. We've got these complex interactions and feedbacks between the trees, the hydrology, the chemical, the physical environment. And like Ian's just explained, these dynamics are really primarily controlled by how much water there is, where there's water, the quality of it, and so on. But if we think about trees, these boggy, wet areas are not easy places to live if you're a tree. Trees need to take up oxygen via their roots for respiration to grow, and normally that oxygen is in the air-filled soil pores, and that diffuses through the root hairs and that travels through the root and into the tree. But when you have saturated conditions and high water tables, most of those soil pores are filled with water rather than air, and that reduces the amount of oxygen that's available and it creates anoxia in the soil. And this anoxia is what leads to root stress, and that's a major controller on which trees can grow where. So nearly all trees can cope with some level of flooding, some short periods of flooding, like if literally any tree can probably deal with a little bit, but the longer a site is saturated, the more the stress, and different species have got different levels of tolerances to this. And these are just some of the common wet woodland tree species that we've been speaking about. And there's others that would, like last week, I think people were talking about white elm, and then there's Scots pine that's sometimes found on tree bog woodland. So if, while I'm talking through this, if you feel free to put others in the chat that you think of and any tolerances that you know of them. So some of the most common species are the alder and willow, and they're persistent, tolerant of this persistent waterlogging, and they develop some quite effective adaptations, which I'll talk about in a moment. And so they're some of the most common tree species we'll find, and then you can kind of go down the list a little bit, and poplar is not so common, but it's tolerant of the short-term flooding. It grows quite well in wet soils, and develops some adaptations, but it doesn't do well with persistent waterlogging and saturation. And then ash is, you get tolerant of episodic flooding, but it starts to show injury after when it's continuously waterlogged, particularly in settings with stagnant rather than moving water. So they can tolerate some flooding, but it's less adaptive than the willows and the alder. And then I've added birch on here. It's the least tolerant of flooding. It's often, I don't really see it as a wet woodland tree species, but I'm including it because it can grow on waterlogged peats, and it's often seen in a peatland context. But in those contexts, it prefers a drier hummocks where it's more aerated. It doesn't cope well with the continuous submergence, particularly in the growing season. So just from looking at the tree species that you have, the dominance, the composition, it gives you an idea about the hydrological regime, even without any hydrological monitoring. But I do want to make a point about, I mentioned birch and peatlands. I just want to make a point that some situations that we wouldn't consider wet woodland, even though they might have the right type of tree species and in what might seem like possibly the right places. And this is particularly the case of degraded peatlands. And I think I saw some people chatting in the chat earlier, but didn't get a chance to read it all about trees on peat. So the photos on the left is scrub development. In this case, it's willow on degraded, drained peatland. And the colonisation of these trees on this situation is really rapid. It happens within a few years. It can form these really dense, closed canopy stands, these really small willow shoots in this instance. So it's a common wet woody habitat species, willow, on a wettish site, a peatland. But this site is formerly a lowland raised bog, and trees wouldn't naturally be part of this system in a healthy condition. And the trees here are probably contributing to the peat degradation by lowering the water table with such a dense canopy. And natural tree growth for this type of ecosystem would have been way more of an open canopy, but with sparse dotted trees, about stunted tree growth, slightly raised, growing on these slightly raised areas of the microtopography, and you'd only have denser stands on the edges where there's more greater like groundwater influence. So a bit like this photo on the right, which is a bog woodland, or as close as a bog woodland that we can get. It's from Scotland, and that is a type of wet woodland. So even though it doesn't look very wood-like, it has these really slow growing stunted trees, really sparse canopy, and trees are an important part of that system, but they're much more open canopy than what you have on the left. And that just as a side point, the photos on the left are from the Natural England Moss-side farm site in the Manchester Mosses, and we're running some really interesting experiments on the scrub development and scrub clearance to see whether this type of situation can develop into a healthy wet woodland as part of a trajectory of peatland restoration to bog. But let's just get back to thinking about the adaptations. And I mentioned that with the waterlogged soils, oxygen is really hard for the roots to get. So supplying oxygen is the real challenge for any wetland tree, and there's some really clever adaptations that help, and nearly all of them are focused on helping gas exchange through the tree. So there's just a few of them on the slide. There's some extra ones. If anyone knows a lot about this, feel free to put them in the chat for everyone else to learn about. So you have parenchyma, which are these air-filled tissues in the roots and the stems, and they make it easy for oxygen to diffuse through the roots, through the shoots into the roots, and it gives more oxygen to the roots to compensate for the lack of oxygen in the soil. And that also helps with something called radial oxygen loss, ROL, where oxygen is diffused out of the roots into the soil, and it kind of makes this sort of protective area around the roots that's higher in oxygen, and that reduces the root stress for the trees to grow better. And then you get hyperphytrid lenticels, so these basically just larger pores growing on the bark and the stems, and they get bigger when it's waterlogged. and that makes it easier for oxygen to diffuse from the atmosphere into the tree stem and get transported down to the roots. And you often see that get this stem-based swelling on the trees in these ecosystems. You get sort of these bulges at the trunk at the water level. Another adaptation you see is adventitious roots. So really good way of helping oxygen to reach the roots, and they're filled with those larger pores, parenchyma, which can help transport oxygen. And they're basically like a specialized root that will form on non-root tissue, so they can form on stems and branches to help get more oxygen to the tree. And they also they look pretty good in the way you can see that they're almost like acting as anchors as well for the tree, so they kind of help with stabilizing in unstable rooting conditions. And then linked to that, the last one on there is the shallow rooting. It's another adaptation. It's almost like the trees are often forced to the roots to stay nearer the surface, so they get better access to the air and the surface soil layer, which has got where the most oxygen is. So a trade-off of that, if you have shallow rooting, is that the trees are often less stable in a lot of these systems, and it's one of the reasons that you get a lot of tree fall, and it's a critical part of their dynamic nature and the contribution of the deadwood and the structural complexity and all of that, which supports such a rich ecosystem. And it's, I suppose the point I want to get across here is that it's not a passive relationship between the trees and the rest of the environment. The trees can engineer the environment, particularly the hydrology, and they make a lot of difference to the hydrology. So the most common way they change it is through transpiration during the growing season. The trees using up lots of water, it draws down the water table, and you think about rain landing on a tree. This is, you all know that interception, the leaves intercept the rainfall, and a lot of that gets evaporated, and so it means that it's often drier directly beneath the tree canopy, and sometimes the water table is several centimeters lower during the growing season, and that actually helps reduce the stress on the tree roots, and it provides these slightly drier areas where you get less wet tolerant plants that can coexist under these in these really wet conditions. So it can create, again, it's creating this really important microtopography. And in the winter, when there's no leaves, the transpiration, the interception is really minimal, and the water table is often higher. So it provides this seasonal water table signal from the trees alone, even if the incoming water remains stable. And these mechanisms are really, really dependent on the site. It's hard to be general in these situations because it just massively depends on the hydrological regime of the site, where the water's coming from, how dense the canopy is, the type of trees, and the microclimate, and so on. But the point being that there's these interactions and feedbacks between the tree and the hydrology. And another way that the trees are interacting with the water environment is through the deadwood and the litter. And I assume this will be talked about much more in later webinars when we're talking about ecosystem services. But the litter and the fallen branches and the trunks help retain the water, they slow the runoff, they can improve the soil structure by creating macropores, and that can enhance infiltration and water storage capacity. And in a healthy wet woodland site, you'd expect to see a significant amount of fallen and standing deadwood, and again, it's really important for biodiversity provision. And then, similar to the deadwood, you get some wet woodland trees, particularly like willow, can produce this large living wood. Basically, it's fallen but alive. Often it's quite hard to work out what is alive and what's dead sometimes of the year, because you have these large trunks or branches that sprout new roots and new shoots, and it helps with the natural regeneration of a woodland in conditions where it's particularly difficult for seedlings to establish in sites which are flooded regularly. And these fallen trunks can provide an anchor for the tree and compensate for some of the shallow rooting. Then they help trap the sediment and other debris, and they can create these really quite amazing semi-permanent structures that can help stabilize the woodland environment and creating all these extra drier areas for different species. And the shallow rooting in many sites will mean that there's this high proportion of trunks that are growing at all sorts of random angles and positions, particularly the larger trees that become unstable. And I don't know if you can see it very well, but there's the study from Wheatfen and Norfolk Broads was done many years ago now. It isn't online, so I can't link to it, but I love how it demonstrates this kind of complexity of some of these systems. So they used these quadrats and they mapped out the location of each trunk and created these little diagrams where you can see the density of the fallen trunks and the prostate trunks with iterative growth coming up from them, these raised root areas where there's lots of trunks kind of together fallen down, and it starts to build up this picture of complex tree growth and well-developed microtopography on the ground, all these different niches and microhabitat features. When we're thinking about expansion beyond the current woodland edge rather than just within the woodland, the seed sources are particularly important. I think people were talking about this in the chat earlier. The seed dispersal is typically by wind and water, so hydrologically connected systems have a much better chance of naturally regenerating or establishing. And existing wet woodland, even small patches, which a lot of them are, small patches are likely to be quite important nuclei for new woodland establishing or those patches expanding. So depending on the location, the type, and assuming the hydrology is suitable, these types of systems can establish pretty rapidly with very little intervention or effort, often creating fairly well-developed canopies within a couple of decades. And this drone photo shows a triple SI site we work on in the Broads or across on the River Yare. And it's a constant battle by the site wardens to stop the trees from establishing everywhere and to keep that mosaic of open habitats as well. So they want the open water, they want the open fen and the car woodland. And if they didn't do any management, those trees would easily establish across the whole site. And it just goes to show how quickly and easily they can establish if they have the seed sources and the suitable locations to do so. And if anyone's familiar with the Broads, there's an awful lot of wet woodland that's re-established in the last 50 or more so years, typically just from all of the abundant seed sources, and from when the woodland clearance stops, there's been an awful lot which has sprung up since then. And one of the projects we're working on at the moment is to use a trees outside of woodlands map, which I assume you're familiar with, and Emma can drop it into the chat if not. But all of the map of all the trees that are not in woodlands, so small patches of lone trees. And we're looking at using that to work out where the woodland of those are and the seed sources, and then map potential areas for expansion. So linking up isolated patches or trying to enlarge existing patches that could then help shift the habitat to a favourable conservation status. So we're starting with wet woodlands on peat first, because it's the easiest place to start with the new England peat map. And this image, I don't know if you can spot that it's England, but it's thousands of tiny polygons. There were just small tiny patches of trees on peat across England that might be suitable seed sources for wet woody habitat expansion. And the tree presence has an important role in the carbon dynamics as well. And I won't spend too much time on this. I assume it will come up with the ecosystem services work, but there's some wet woodlands can store peat and accumulate peat. So you have the carbon in the biomass of the trees, as well as the peat below ground, and it's the trunks and the branches and leaves that grow and die, and all of the waterlogged conditions and the lack of oxygen means that the they don't rot basically, and the peat is woodier and it's really high in lignin, which is resistant to decay, so you get these amazing pieces of wood. Yes, so you have the carbon stores, but also we can't really talk about carbon cycle without thinking about methane, and so these anoxic conditions are great for carbon, but also great for methane production by the microbes. So all wetlands emit methane. Wet woodlands are no different. It just very quick 101 on methane production in wet woodlands. Because the plants are adapted to waterlogging, and they develop these tissues with the large air-filled spaces. That helps transport oxygen from the atmosphere to the roots, but that same pathway allows the methane to move upwards from the waterlogged soil where it's produced and released into the air from the plant stems and leaves. And any wetland plant with tissue like that, with the Erenchyma, it offers a path of least resistance for methane transport compared to any other diffusion or ebullition. So the common plants for wetlands is the rushes, the sedges, the typha, cotton grass, trees, and so on. They basically act as little chimneys where the methane can travel straight from the waterlogged soil to the air, which is why I've got a photo of the chimneys. I couldn't find a better image to. That's how you can think of them, just little chimneys of gas exchange from the soil to the air. And although wetlands are natural sources of methane, most are considered to be sinks of carbon, and this is still quite an active area of research on the wet woody habitats, and it's something that we're working on trying to get some evidence for. And just to finish up, just wanted to put some ideas here, what makes a healthy wet woodland, and I'd like you to add more in the chat if you've got any. And hopefully the whole webinar series is going to give you all of these and more. And they're really inherently dynamic. And Ian was mentioning the succession, and the ecological theory portrayed them as this linear succession from open water to wet fen to wet woodland to dry woodland. But the dry woodland isn't the norm. That's usually due to drainage. It's much more common to get switches between the wooded and open landscapes. You get these mosaics of wet and dry, open and wooded, and you have all these different features within them. And it holds true for the photo here is not at all like a bog woodland that I showed earlier, which has a much sparser canopy, but a lot of these hold true for that as well. And to be well managed means to kind of embrace their dynamism and allow the natural processes to occur, and crucially to protect the water supply to allow those natural processes to occur. And just a little bit more context for the Wet Woodland Research Network, these systems have been understudied for quite some time now. There's lots of bits of work on them in different places, but we're trying to pull them together into a bit more of a focus and slowly starting to build up more evidence on how they form and function and their longer term dynamics. And we're establishing a network of monitoring sites as and when we have capacity. So if you do have ongoing monitoring on any wet woody habitats, we'd be really interested to hear from you. And that is me. Just in time.